1. Historical background. The region of Volhynia. Volhynia, also known as Volyn, is a region steeped in historical significance. Situated in Eastern Europe, it encompasses parts of modern-day Western Ukraine and historically straddled the borderlands between Polish and Ukrainian cultures. Geography and importance. Volhynia is characterized by fertile plains, dense forests, and an abundance of rivers, making it a strategically valuable and agriculturally rich region. Its location along trade routes made it a contested area for centuries. Cultural crossroads. For much of its history, Volhynia was a melting pot of various ethnic groups, including Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, Czechs, and Germans. This diversity, while enriching in some respects, also sowed the seeds of conflict. By the early 20th century, the ethnic composition was roughly 70 to 75% Ukrainians, mostly Orthodox Christians who formed the majority rural population, 16 to 18% Poles, primarily Roman Catholics concentrated in towns and administrative roles, 10 to 12% Jews and others. Jews were integral to local commerce and craftsmanship, while smaller groups such as Czechs and Germans were often settlers. The interactions between these groups were influenced by social hierarchies, religious differences, and economic disparities, often fostering resentment. 1.2. Ukrainian nationalist movement. Origins of nationalism. Ukrainian nationalism gained momentum in the 19th century as part of the broader wave of national awakening in Eastern Europe. Under Austrian and Russian rule, Ukrainians struggled to assert their cultural and political identity. Russification and Polonization. Ukrainians faced systematic suppression of their language, religion, and traditions, particularly under Russian rule. Polish influence was also dominant in regions like Galicia and Volhynia, further fueling nationalist aspirations. Emergence of political movements. By the early 20th century, Ukrainian intellectuals and activists sought to define a Ukrainian identity distinct from both Russian and Polish influences. Formation of OUN. The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN, was founded in 1929 in Vienna by Ukrainian émigrés and intellectuals. It aimed to establish an independent Ukrainian state through revolutionary means, remove or assimilate non-Ukrainian populations perceived as obstacles to this goal. The OUN split into two factions in 1940, highlighted the movement's internal tensions. OUN-M, Melnik faction, advocated for diplomatic and moderate approaches, seeking cooperation with Axis powers. OUN-B, Bandera faction, embraced radical, militant methods under Stepan Bandera's leadership. This faction viewed violence as a necessary tool to achieve independence and saw Poles and Jews as primary adversaries. Anti-Polish sentiment. The OUN-B perceived the Polish population in Volhynia as colonial occupiers, oppressors, and a direct threat to Ukrainian statehood. This animosity was exacerbated by historical conflicts, centuries of Polish dominance in Ukrainian territories, recent policies, the interwar Polish government's actions described below. Interwar Polish rule, 1919 to 1939, Treaty of Riga and Volhynia's status. Following the Polish-Soviet War, 1919 to 1921, the Treaty of Riga ceded Volhynia to the Second Polish Republic. While this secured Polish sovereignty over the region, it also created tensions. Ukrainian aspirations denied. Ukrainians, who had briefly declared independence during the chaotic years of World War I, were disappointed by the treaty, which ignored their nationalist goals. Polish resettlement. The Polish government encouraged the settlement of ethnic Poles in Volhynia to solidify control, often at the expense of local Ukrainians. Polonization policies. Poland implemented a series of measures aimed at assimilating or suppressing its minority populations. 1. Cultural suppression. Ukrainian language schools were closed, and Ukrainian cultural organizations were banned. 2. Land reforms. Polish settlers were given preferential treatment in land distribution, exacerbating economic disparities. 3. Religious domination. The Roman Catholic Church, associated with Polish identity, was favored over the Eastern Orthodox Church, deepening religious divides. Impact on Ukrainian identity. These policies alienated Ukrainians who felt like second-class citizens in their own homeland. Nationalist resentment. The repressive environment strengthened support for radical Ukrainian nationalist groups like the OUN. Social tensions. Polish-Ukrainian relations became increasingly hostile, with frequent skirmishes and acts of sabotage by Ukrainian insurgents. 1.4. World War II and Nazi-Soviet occupation. 1939 to 1941 Soviet occupation. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union led to the Soviet occupation of Volhynia in 1939. This period saw mass repressions. The NKVD arrested, deported, and executed thousands of Poles, Ukrainians, and Jews suspected of opposing Soviet rule. Land reforms. Soviet authorities confiscated land from wealthy Poles and redistributed it to Ukrainian peasants, stoking class and ethnic tensions. 1941 to 1944. Nazi occupation. Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, brought another wave of chaos to Volhynia. Extermination of Jews. The Jewish population, which had already suffered under Soviet rule, faced systematic annihilation during the Holocaust. Entire Jewish communities in Volhynia were wiped out. Ethnic tensions exploited. The Nazis encouraged divisions between Poles and Ukrainians, using the UPA and other nationalist groups to suppress Soviet partisans and control the local population. Rise of UPA, Ukrainian Insurgent Army. In 1942, the UPA emerged as the armed wing of the ONB, fight against both Nazi and Soviet forces. Establish a Ukrainian ethno-state by expelling or exterminating non-Ukrainian populations. The UPA's anti-Polish campaign intensified under the belief that eliminating Poles would prevent them from reclaiming Volhynia after the war. Polish underground resistance. During this time, Polish resistance movements, including the Armia Krajowa Home Army, began organizing self-defense units in Volhynia. While initially focused on resisting Nazi and Soviet forces, these groups also clashed with Ukrainian nationalists, setting the stage for the Volhynian massacres. 2. Targeting churches and atrocities. 2.1. Attacks on churches. The decision to target churches during Sunday Masses was not arbitrary, but strategic. Churches were not just places of worship, but also centers of Polish community life, culture, and identity. Attacking them was an attempt to dismantle the spiritual and social fabric of the Polish population. Maximized impact. Knowing that entire families attended Sunday services, UPA units could kill large numbers of people in a single attack. Survivors recount harrowing scenes of churchgoers being slaughtered or burned alive inside their sanctuaries. SNAT 2.2. Methods of destruction. The violence often included a range of inhumane tactics. Arson. Entire villages were set on fire, with families burned alive in their homes. Use of tools. Axes, scythes, and pitchforks were common weapons not only because of ammunition shortages, but also to instill terror. Psychological warfare. Public mutilations and brutal killings were often intended to send a clear message to surviving Poles: leave or face a similar fate. 3. Retaliation by Poles. 3.1. Organized resistance. Polish self-defense units emerged as desperate measures to protect their communities. Improvised defense. Many units lacked proper military training and equipment, relying on hunting rifles, pitchforks, and other tools. Collaboration with Armia Krajowa, the Polish underground army, provided some support, but was stretched thin due to its engagement against Nazi and Soviet forces. Defense lines. In some areas, Polish communities established fortified settlements and coordinated defense with neighboring villages. Counterattacks. The Polish Home Army and self-defense groups occasionally launched preemptive or retaliatory strikes. While these were aimed at UPA fighters, Ukrainian civilians were also often caught in the crossfire. Some villages perceived as harboring UPA members were destroyed, resulting in Ukrainian civilian casualties. 4. The nature of the atrocities. 4.1. Ethnic cleansing or genocide? The term used to describe the Volhynian massacre varies. Ethnic cleansing? Many historians categorize it as ethnic cleansing, given the UPA's explicit aim to remove Poles from Ukrainian territories. Genocide. Poland officially recognizes it as genocide due to the systematic and premeditated nature of the killings. 4.2. Comparative brutality. While the UPA targeted Poles systematically, the retaliatory Polish actions, though brutal, were less widespread and organized. Victimization of civilians. Both sides targeted civilians, with Polish women, children, and the elderly suffering disproportionately in UPA attacks. Broader historical context. 1. Wartime chaos. The massacre unfolded amidst the broader backdrop of World War II, which saw Nazi atrocities. The Holocaust devastated Jewish communities in Volhynia, often with complicity or indifference from local populations. Soviet repression. The Soviet NKVD secret police carried out mass arrests and executions, targeting both Poles and Ukrainians. Hashtag 5.2. Historical grievances. Long-standing ethnic and political grievances fueled the violence. Polish-Ukrainian rivalry. Both groups laid historical claims to Volhynia, viewing the other as illegitimate occupiers. Suppressed identities. Under Polish rule, Ukrainians felt marginalized, while Poles in Soviet-occupied areas experienced repression. 5.3. Manipulation by external forces. Nazi Germany. The Nazis exploited ethnic tensions, encouraging division to maintain control. Soviet influence. The USSR capitalized on post-massacre tensions to justify harsh crackdowns on nationalist movements. 6. Cultural and psychological impact. 6.1. Survivor trauma. Many survivors carried lifelong psychological scars. Accounts of parents witnessing their children's brutal deaths, or vice versa, highlight the unimaginable horror endured. Survivor testimonies often recount vivid nightmares, distrust of other ethnic groups, and an inability to return to their ancestral homes. 6.2. Erasure of communities. Hundreds of Polish villages ceased to exist after the massacres, their populations either killed or forcibly displaced. Legacy of hate. The massacres left a legacy of interethnic mistrust, with communities on both sides passing down stories of victimization to future generations. 7. Modern implications. Efforts toward reconciliation. Joint commemorations. In recent years, some Polish and Ukrainian leaders have participated in joint ceremonies to honor the victims and promote reconciliation. Historical dialogue. Historians from both countries have collaborated on research, though interpretations remain contested. 7.2. Politicization of history. The Volhynian massacre has often been used as a political tool, with some factions in both countries exploiting it to fuel nationalism. Debates over memorials, school curricula, and public recognition of the events continue to stir controversy. 8. Broader lessons. 1. The perils of ethnic nationalism. The Volhynian massacre exemplifies how ethnic nationalism, when combined with war and extremist ideologies, can lead to atrocities. 8.2. Importance of historical acknowledgement. Addressing historical grievances openly and empathetically is crucial for reconciliation. Denial or minimization of past atrocities only deepens divisions. 8.3. The role of education. Educating younger generations about the massacre, its causes, and its consequences can help prevent the repetition of similar atrocities.